Hi Seagull class. Our new Read-Aloud is called Was Sacagawea? And it was written by Judith Bloom Freden and Dennis Brindle Freden. Here's the front cover. I'll get started on it. Who was Sacagawea? In the year 2000, the United States issued a new dollar coin. Its head side shows an American Indian woman, and she is carrying her baby. Here's an illustration of that coin. Who is this young mother? Her name was Sacagawea. 200 years ago, she met with the Lewis and Clark expedition. The explorers traveled across the American Northwest. When the explorers were hungry, she found food. When they met Indians along the way, she acted as translator. Thanks to Sacagawea's help, the expedition was a success. The Lewis and Clark expedition changed American history. It helped the United States settle a huge region. This area included what became of the states Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. Here's a map to show you. Here's the United States, here's Florida, and this whole area was where the Lewis and Clark expedition explored. So before then, the settlers only knew about this area, and there were lots of Native American tribes that lived all over the land, and in Canada too, in Mexico. But this area that would become the United States was only right here for a while. And then they didn't know what was on this side, the British settlers, until they explored. Sacagawea was only 16 years old when she crossed America with a baby on her back. This is her true story. Chapter 1. A Shoshone Girl. Sacagawea was born in what is now Idaho in 1789 or 1790. She was Shoshone Indian. Her tribe lived along the Bitterroot Range of the Rocky Mountains. They often camped near the Snake River, so they were also called the Snake Indians. As a child, she had many different names. This was common for young Indians. In time, she became known as Sacagawea. Sakaja means bird, and Wea means woman, so her name means bird woman. She may have been called bird woman because she was small and moved quickly like a bird. Sacagawea had an older brother named Kamiawait. She also had another brother and a sister. Her family lived in a tent called a teepee. The Shoshone were peaceful warriors. Here's a picture of the interior of a teepee. These are the flaps that could be opened for smoke to escape. This says lacing pins were removed so that the flap could be folded down. Here's a backrest right here. A medicine bag. Buffalo hide bedding. And here's a person cooking over a fire. Teepees were used by some tribes who moved around because they could easily be packed up, just like tents are today. And we know people who move around and are not settled in one place are called nomadic or nomads. Between May and September, the Shoshone camped along the streams. There they fished for salmon and trout. And in fall, they packed their teepees onto horses. They headed east to the plains of present-day Montana. And there the men hunted buffalo, riding on horseback and using bows and arrows. The weather was often very cold, so Shoshone men and women and children needed lots of warm clothing. Sacagawea wore a dress and leggings that were made out of deerskins. Over these went a knee-length robe made from buffalo hides. The robe became her blanket at night. Her warm winter shoes were made from buffalo hide with the woolly hair on the inside. Her clothes were decorated with beads and porcupine quills. Here's a little section on buffalo hunting, which I'll read a little later. The Shoshone did not have schools. Sacagawea learned by working beside the women of her tribe. She collected wood for fires. She helped make moccasins, clothing, and teepees. She picked berries and dug roots for her family to eat. She learned to make medicines from plants. The village elders taught Sacagawea the beliefs of her people. She heard how the Creator made the world and Coyote made human beings. She was warned about the little people who shot invisible arrows, and for fun she ran races and juggled mud balls with her friends. Like all Shoshone girls, Sacagawea was promised to an older man. She would become his wife when she turned 13 or 14. But in 1800, her life changed forever. Sacagawea was just 10 or 11 at the time. Her tribe was camped near what is now Three Forks, Montana. Suddenly, Minotari Indians attacked. This enemy tribe had guns. The Shoshone only had bows and arrows. 15 of Sacagawea's people died in the attack. The rest of them fled to the woods. The Minotari chased them, taking women and children prisoner. Sacagawea was running across the river when a warrior grabbed her. He pulled her onto his horse and rode away. Her best friend was also captured. Sacagawea and the other prisoners were taken 600 miles to a Minotari village in what is now North Dakota. Her friend escaped, but Sacagawea didn't. The young Shoshone girl was given to a Minotari family. Sacagawea was a prisoner among strangers. She was hundreds of miles from home. She missed her family. She did not even know if they were still alive. A fur trader from Canada often visited the village where Sacagawea now lived. His name was Toussaint Charbonneau. Charbonneau was 3 times as old as Bird Woman, but when he saw her, he wanted her for his wife. The Minotari traded her to him, and just like that, Sacagawea became one of his Indian wives. Now she belonged to another stranger. Sacagawea and her husband settled in a village of Mandan and Minotari Indians. By the age of about 15, she was expecting a child. Her baby was not yet born when some strangers arrived in the village. Once again, Bird Woman's life was about to change forever. That was the end of chapter 1. I'm going to go back and read this part about buffaloes and then this part about Thomas Jefferson before we read chapter 2. Buffalo hunting. The American bison is also called the American buffalo. A large male bison is about the size of a small minivan. At the time of the Lewis and Clark expedition, more than 50 million bison roamed the Great Plains. The Shoshone and other Plains Indians depended on them for food, warm clothing, and shelter. Their teepees were made of buffalo hides. Whites began to settle the Great Plains shortly after the expedition. The United States government tried to force the Indian tribes to live on the reservations, which were smaller pieces of land. In the late 1800s, white buffalo hunters killed all but 550 American bison. Having lost their food and shelter, the Indians moved to the reservations. During the mid-1900s, some bison were returned to the prairies. Today, 150,000 bison live on ranches and in national parks in the United States and Canada. So that was about buffalo hunting, and then this part is about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who was born in 1743 and died in 1826, was born in Virginia's Albemarle County. His family owned a plantation and about 20 slaves. In 1776, Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Soon after the United States became a nation, he tried to send out 2 expeditions to explore the American West. Both attempts failed. Jefferson became our nation's 3rd president in 1801. In 1803, Congress granted President Jefferson $2,500 to explore North America. He sent out Lewis and Clark on an expedition from St. Louis late that summer. President Jefferson served 2 terms as president, from 1801 to 1809. He later founded and built the University of Virginia. His personal library of 6,400 books became the core collection of the Library of Congress. Thomas Jefferson died on the 4th of July in 1826. So that's who was president during this time of this story. Chapter 2, Visitors. 2 centuries ago, the United States was much smaller than it is today. It only included the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. The country got much bigger in 1803. That year, France sold our young nation 828,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi. This was called the Louisiana Purchase, and it doubled the country's size. The region was later divided into 15 states. Much of this new land was unexplored. What did it look like? Who lived there? What plants and animals might be found? President Thomas Jefferson planned an expedition to head northwest to the Pacific Ocean. The explorers would travel mainly by river, and they would make maps of the land. They would trade with Native Americans along the way. The voyagers would do more than visit the territory of the Louisiana Purchase. They would also explore what is now Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. Great Britain also had its eye on this territory. Jefferson wanted American explorers to get there first, and that would strengthen the U.S. claims to the region. Nobody stopped to think that the land already belonged to the Indians. 2 army men would lead their expedition. One was 29-year-old Meriwether Lewis. He was President Jefferson's friend and personal secretary. Lewis picked William Clark as his co-captain. The 33-year-old Clark was tall and friendly with red hair. Clark's first task was to find men for the expedition, so he and Lewis needed men who could hunt and build boats and forts. They needed men who could handle horses. President Jefferson wanted a record of the trip, so men who could keep journals were also needed. Most of what we know about Sacagawea has come from these journals. Captain Clark gathered 43 men. They call themselves the Corps of Discovery. Several spoke French. One knew Indian Sign Language. Another played the violin, and he would entertain the men when they were far from home. Clark's slave York also made the trip. One member of the group had 4 feet. Captain Lewis brought along Seaman, his 140-pound Newfoundland dog. On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery set out from St. Louis. They began rowing up the Missouri River in a barge and 2 smaller boats. By late October, the time the Indians called the Moon of the Falling Leaves, the explorers had reached central North Dakota. This is where Sacagawea now lived with Charbonneau. The voyagers stopped in the area to camp for winter. There they built a cluster of cabins, which they called Fort Mandan. Soon Charbonneau heard the interesting news. Lewis and Clark were looking for one more person for their expedition. At one stage of their journey, they would need horses to help them cross the Bitterroot Mountains. They hoped to get them from the Shoshone Indians, who were famous for their horse breeding. The explorers would need someone who could speak to the Shoshone. Charbonneau brought his pregnant wife, Sacagawea, to meet Lewis and Clark. She could speak Shoshone, he told them. She was Shoshone. Charbonneau wanted to go along too. He knew French and some Minnetaree. He could also help the explorers. The captains asked Bird Woman and Charbonneau to join them. They agreed to pay the trader $500. In the early 1800s, this was a fortune. Sacagawea and her husband were now part of the Corps of Discovery. The couple moved in Fort Mandan for the winter, and they shared a cabin with Lewis, Clark, and York. On February 11th, 1805, Bird Woman was about to have her baby. To hurry along the birth, she was given a special powder. It was made from a rattlesnake's tail. She drank it with water, and 10 minutes later, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Charbonneau named the child Jean-Baptiste, and Clark called the baby Pomp. He called Sacagawea Jamie. The captains hoped that Sacagawea would be able to help on this long trip, but they had no idea just how valuable she would be. Here's an illustration of the interior of Mandan Earth Lodge. So this is where they stayed for winter. It says, people often sat on the roof and children played there. Here's a storage area, and the sleeping area. Wooden posts held up the roof. An entrance made entirely of wooden posts. Dirt was packed down over the wooden frame. Oh, and they had a smoke hole too. It's the same as the teepee. They had a hole for the smoke to go out because they had fires inside. But this doesn't look like they could pick it up and move it around very easily. Well, that's the end of chapter 2. So tomorrow you'll hear chapter 3 and probably chapter 4, because these chapters seem a little bit shorter than the last Read-Aloud. Well, it sounds like they needed Sacagawea mostly because she spoke Shoshone, and they needed to be able to talk to the Shoshone people to try and buy horses from them so that they could cross some parts of the wild North American area that they were exploring, that Lewis and Clark were exploring. Do you think that people who speak different languages are still useful today? What kinds of jobs do you think that are important to speak more than just one language? I'd be interested to find out what you think.